Welcome back to Sonic Lectures. I called this video musical necromancy on purpose. I want to be upfront about that. I picked that word because I knew it would make some of you uncomfortable. I knew it would make some of you angry before you even clicked play. And I think that discomfort is worth sitting with for a minute before we dive in, because the reaction that word produces, the instinctive recoil, the sense that there is something fundamentally wrong about using technology to bring dead recordings back to life, that reaction is exactly what this video is about. Because here is what I've noticed after spending a significant amount of time thinking about this issue. The people who are most loudly opposed to using AI in music almost never distinguish between what AI is actually being used to do. They lump it all together. AI generating a fake Drake song. AI cloning a living artist's voice without permission. AI writing lyrics. AI producing entire albums with no human involvement. And AI restoring a degraded 60-year-old recording so that people can actually hear it the way it was meant to be heard. All of that gets thrown into the same bucket. All of it gets labeled with the same word. And that word is fake. And it gets dismissed out of hand. And I think that is intellectually lazy. I think it is a failure to engage with the actual question. Because those things are not the same. They are not even close to the same. And until we start making the distinctions that the situation actually requires, we are going to keep having the wrong argument. Loudly and on the internet. While genuinely irreplaceable recorded music continues to degrade and disappear. So today I want to make the case, a real case with a real example with real nuance, for one specific application of AI in music. Not AI composition. Not AI voice cloning. Not AI replacing human musicians. AI restoration. AI remastering. AI giving recordings a second life that they would not otherwise have. And I want to do it through the story of a band you have almost certainly never heard of. A cult college band from 1991 from Denton, Texas, of all places, called the Funky Butts. And I promise you by the end of this video, that name is going to mean something to you. Because their story is the clearest, most honest, most emotionally uncomplicated version of this argument I have ever encountered. And that clarity is exactly what this conversation has been missing. If you are new here, subscribe and turn on notifications. Let's get into it. Before I get to this band's story, I need to spend a few minutes being very precise about what I mean when I say AI restoration. Because precision is everything in this conversation, and the lack of it is responsible for most of the confusion. AI music restoration is the use of machine learning models to analyze, repair, and enhance degraded audio recordings. That is it. That is the whole definition. The AI is not composing anything new. It is not inventing performances that never happened. It is not generating vocals in an artist's voice. It is doing something much more analogous to what a photograph restorer does when they take a damaged, faded, torn historical photograph and use digital tools to repair the damage and reveal what was actually there underneath. When a recording from 1930 has surfaced noise from the shellac disc it was pressed onto, AI can identify and remove that noise while preserving the underlying musical information. When a tape recording from 1965 has deteriorated to the point where certain frequency ranges have been lost, AI can analyze the harmonic relationships in the surviving audio and reconstruct what those frequencies most likely contained. When a live bootleg recording has crowd noise overwhelming the performance, AI can separate the signal from the noise in ways that were simply not possible with previous technology. None of that is fabrication. None of that is putting words in a dead artist's mouth or generating performances they never gave. It is recovery. It is the digital equivalent of an archaeologist carefully brushing dirt off a piece of pottery to reveal what was actually there. The pottery existed. The archaeologist is just revealing it. Now I want to acknowledge immediately that there is a spectrum here. And the spectrum matters. Pure noise removal and technical restoration sits at one end of it. That is the least controversial application and the one I am most comfortable defending without qualification. Further along the spectrum, you have remastering, using AI to enhance and improve recordings beyond simply repairing damage, making choices about equalization, dynamics, and spatial presentation that go beyond what the original recording contained. And at the far end of the spectrum you have expansion, using AI to generate new material in the style of an existing artist or catalog, which starts to raise genuinely different questions. The Funky Butts story touches all 3 points on that spectrum. And that is what makes it such a useful case study. Because by the time we get to the end of their story, we are going to have a very clear sense of where the defensible line is and where it starts to blur. And that line is the whole point. Here is something that does not get talked about nearly enough in the AI and music debate. We are in the middle of a preservation crisis. A genuine, urgent, time-sensitive crisis involving recorded music history. and most people have absolutely no idea. The problem operates on multiple levels simultaneously. The first level is physical degradation. Magnetic tape, the medium on which the majority of recorded music from roughly 1950 through the 1990s was captured, is not a stable long-term storage format. It deteriorates. Institutions with the resources to address this, major labels, well-funded archives, national libraries, can temporarily stabilize the original tapes and transfer the audio to digital formats before the tape deteriorates further. But that process is expensive, time-consuming, and requires specialized equipment. The vast majority of tapes that exist in private collections, in storage units, in the closets of musicians who recorded locally in the 60s and 70s and 80s, those tapes are not getting that treatment. They are degrading right now, today, while we are having this AI debate. The second level is obscurity. Not every band that recorded music was famous. The overwhelming majority of recorded music history was made by artists who never achieved significant commercial success. Local bands, regional acts, artists who recorded in small studios, pressed small quantities of vinyl, played small venues, and then either kept going on the margins or stopped entirely. That music exists. Some of it is remarkable, and almost none of it has any institutional protection or preservation infrastructure. When the person who made it dies or loses interest or simply stops caring about what happens to the tapes in their garage, that music is effectively gone. The third level is access. Even recordings that have been preserved in archives are often inaccessible, held by estates that have no commercial incentive to release them, locked in institutional collections that require physical visits and formal applications to access, sitting in formats that require increasingly rare and expensive playback equipment, preserved in the technical sense, unavailable in any practical sense. AI restoration technology represents, for the first time in history, a realistic pathway to addressing all three of those problems at a scale that was previously unimaginable. The cost of AI-assisted restoration is a fraction of traditional methods. The speed is incredibly faster, and the quality of results has improved so dramatically in the past 3 years that recordings that were previously considered too damaged to recover are now being successfully restored. That is the context in which the AI restoration debate needs to happen. Not in the abstract, not as a philosophical exercise, but with the full weight of the fact that we are losing recorded music history right now, and we have a tool that can stop some of that loss. The question of whether we should use it is not a casual one. Which brings me to the Funky Butts, and I want to tell you their story properly because it earns everything that comes after it. The Funky Butts were a cult college band from Denton, Texas. They released an album in 1991 that by any commercial measure was a flop. It went nowhere. It sold next to nothing. It did not get significant radio play. It did not launch careers. It did not spawn any cultural moment that anyone was writing about a year later. By the metrics that the music industry uses to evaluate success, the Funky Butts' 1991 album was an abject failure. And then it almost completely disappeared. That is the default fate of most recorded music that does not achieve commercial success. The physical copies circulate in small numbers among the people who were there, who loved the band, who saw them play. The tapes sit somewhere. The memories fade. And the music, the actual music, the performances, the arrangements, the specific combination of human beings in a specific room at a specific moment in time making a specific sound, that music moves steadily toward permanent inaccessibility. Not because anyone decided it wasn't worth saving, but because nobody had the resources or the infrastructure or the tools to save it. Here is what I want you to understand about a recording like the Funky Butts' 1991 album. It is a historical document. It is evidence that specific human beings existed, that they had specific creative ideas, that those ideas took a specific form, that the form was captured. The fact that the album flopped commercially does not change any of that. The fact that most people have never heard of them does not change any of that. Every recording is a historical document. Every recording is irreplaceable. And the idea that only commercially successful recordings deserve to be preserved is one of the most damaging and least examined assumptions in the entire music industry ecosystem. So here is where it gets interesting. And here is where the AI restoration conversation stops being abstract and starts being real. Someone used AI to resurrect the Funky Butts' 1991 flop. The YouTube video documenting this process is titled, AI Resurrects the Funky Butts' 1991 Flop. It is 21 minutes long. And it is one of the most honest, most undefended, most straightforward examples of what AI audio restoration actually looks like in practice that I have encountered. What the video documents is not fabrication. It is not the creation of performances that never happened. It is the recovery of performances that did happen and that were at risk of becoming permanently inaccessible. The AI was given degraded source material, MP3 files of the actual recordings from 1991, with the intention to restore and clarify what was actually there. Surface noise removed. Frequency response improved. The spatial relationships between instruments clarified. The performances themselves, the actual playing, the actual singing, the actual human beings making the actual music, those are meant to be untouched. Because that is not what restoration does. Restoration reveals. It does not invent. The ability to restore and clean up recordings is genuinely remarkable. Not because AI made the music better than it was, but because AI makes the music audible in a way it was not before. Because it removes the technical barriers between the listener and the performance. Because it does for recordings what baking a deteriorating tape does for a physical archive. It stabilizes and clarifies what was actually there so that it could be heard and appreciated and preserved for whatever comes next. Now here is the question I want to ask directly. Is there anything wrong with that? Is there anything ethically problematic about using technology to make a degraded recording audible? About giving a performance a second chance to be heard that it would not otherwise have? About ensuring that the evidence of a specific group of human beings making a specific kind of music in a specific moment in time does not simply vanish because nobody had the resources to rescue it through traditional means? I genuinely cannot find the ethical problem there. I have looked for it. I have tried to construct the argument against it. And the most I can come up with is a vague discomfort about authenticity, a feeling that the restored version is somehow less real than the original degraded version. And I want to push back on that feeling pretty hard. Because a recording so degraded that it cannot be heard is not more authentic than a restored recording that can be heard. It is just less accessible. And inaccessibility is not the same thing as purity. And then there is the Suno playlist, which is where the story gets genuinely complicated. And where I am going to be honest with you about where my own comfort level starts to shift. Funky Butts 2026 is a 17-track Suno playlist released to celebrate the band's 35th anniversary. It is described as a remastered, expanded album, available free on Suno. And the key word there is expanded. Because the tracks on this playlist are not purely restored versions of the 1991 recordings. Because the original master tapes are long lost. They are, in fact, AI-generated or AI-remastered versions that go beyond the original material, adding production elements, reimagining arrangements, in some cases generating entirely new sonic context for the underlying songs. Listen to some of the production descriptions attached to these tracks. Denton Town is described as an indie pop-rock foundation with a light jazz and calypso influence, keeping the original tempo and song structure, but with clean electric guitar adding offbeat syncopated calypso-style strums and soft jazz chord voicings that are not in the original. Effervescent is a cinematic rock guitar instrumental that builds from clean to overdriven, with the arrangement described as preserving the original 135 BPM structure while gradually layering guitars and dynamics toward a soaring emotional climax. My Old Cooked Meat is described as improving upon the band's original funk-inspired comedy tune. These are not restorations. These are transformations. And I want to be very clear that I am not saying transformation is automatically wrong. The history of music is built on transformation. Cover versions, reinterpretations, remixes, reimaginings, these are legitimate creative acts with a long and honorable tradition. But they are a different thing from restoration. And there's always the question of whether the people who make the original recordings provide their explicit consent to have their recordings used as the raw material for AI-generated transformations. That is a question that matters. It is a question that the restoration argument does not have to answer. But the expansion argument absolutely does. Here is how I think about the distinction. Restoration asks, what was actually there and how do we make it audible? Expansion asks, what could be there and how do we build it? Restoration serves the original recording. Expansion serves a new creative vision that uses the original recording as a starting point. Both can be done well or badly. Both can produce results that are valuable or results that are exploitative. But they are not the same thing, and they should not be evaluated by the same criteria. The Funky But Suno playlist sits somewhere in the middle of that spectrum. Some tracks lean toward remastering, enhanced versions of existing recordings that are clearly still recognizable as original performances. Others lean toward generation, new musical content built in the style of the band. And the fact that it was released for free by the band, to mark an anniversary, makes the ethical picture considerably cleaner than it would be if a label had done this without the band's knowledge to generate streaming revenue. But I raise it because the spectrum is real and the distinctions matter. And because the most honest version of the case for AI musical necromancy has to acknowledge where the defensible territory ends and the more complicated territory begins. Let me now address the feeling some of you may have that a restored recording is somehow less real than the original degraded version. I understand where it comes from. There is something that feels like integrity when encountering a historical recording in its damaged, degraded, scratchy original form. The imperfections are evidence of age and passage of time. Like the highly influential 1930s recordings of bluesman Robert Johnson, they connect the listener to the historical moment in a way that a cleaned-up version does not. And I get that. I genuinely do. But I think that feeling is best honored by preserving both versions, the original degraded recording and the restored version, rather than by allowing the original to deteriorate to the point where neither version can be heard by anyone. So here is where I land on all of this. Here is the line I am drawing and why. AI restoration of degraded historical recordings, the recovery of what was actually there, the removal of technical barriers between the listener and the original performance, that is not just defensible. It is necessary. It is an act of cultural stewardship. It is the responsible application of available technology to a genuine preservation crisis. And opposing it on the grounds that it feels inauthentic is a position that has to reckon seriously with the sad alternative, which is permanent loss. AI remastering, enhancing recordings beyond pure restoration, making aesthetic choices about how the music should sound that go beyond what the original recording contained, that is more complicated and requires more transparency and more explicit consent framework. But it is not automatically wrong. Remastering has always involved aesthetic choices. The question is who makes them and on whose behalf. AI expansion, generating new material in the style of an existing artist or catalog, using original recordings as raw material for new creative works, that is a different conversation entirely. It can be done ethically and it can be done exploitatively, and the difference between those two outcomes is almost entirely a function of consent, transparency, and who benefits financially from the result. The Funky But story, taken as a whole, illustrates all three of those categories with unusual clarity. And the reason I find it so valuable as a case study is that it is emotionally uncomplicated, in a way that most AI music debates are not. Nobody is exploiting a dead celebrity. Nobody is generating fake performances for commercial gain. Nobody is deceiving listeners about what they are hearing. It is a group of people who loved a band that almost nobody else loved, using available technology to make sure that the band's music survives decades removed from its inception, and can be heard today. That is the most defensible version of the argument. That is musical necromancy at its best. And if you cannot get comfortable with that version of the argument, I genuinely want to know why. Because I think the discomfort you are feeling is worth examining. And I think examining it carefully is how we get to the frameworks and the standards and the legal structures that the broader AI and music conversation desperately needs. So there it is. The case for using AI to perform musical necromancy, at least the version of it that I can actually defend with a straight face and a clear conscience. Not AI replacing musicians. Not AI faking performances. Not AI generating content without consent for commercial exploitation. AI recovering what was actually there. AI making audible what was becoming permanently inaccessible. AI giving the Funky But's 1991 flop a second chance to be heard 35 years after it almost vanished completely. Is that necromancy? Maybe. But if it is, I think it is the kind of necromancy that music history desperately needs more of. And the alternative, letting the recordings degrade, letting the tapes deteriorate, letting the performances disappear, that is not authenticity. That is loss. A profound one. Tell me where you land on this in the comments. I have given you my position as clearly as I can. I want to hear yours, especially if you disagree. Especially if you think I have drawn the line in the wrong place or missed something important in the argument. This conversation is only going to get more urgent as the technology gets better and more accessible. And the people having it need to be more precise, more honest, and more willing to make the distinctions that the situation actually requires. Hit the like button if this made you think. Subscribe if you want more of this kind of conversation. And I'll see you in the next one.